Hello tankers, big and small! I'm Stan, I'm your host, and welcome to a new Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. Now we're gonna cover a very obscure French amphibious tank of the early Cold War, which will make many of you who play World of Tanks or War Thunder go gaijin or wargaming, please. Now if you play any of the current tank games online, please do check out our website. There's a lot of info on the tanks that are already in the games, and there's also a lot of info on tanks that might or might not be added in the games soon. With that said, let's get on to the article. Immediately after the conclusion of the Second World War, France found itself embroiled in a large-scale guerrilla war in its colony of Indochina, as it attempted to reassert control over the area. Seeking to overthrow their colonial rulers was the Vietnamese Việt Minh, led by Hô Chi Minh, as well as associated Laotian and Cambodian movements. Indochina was a particular theatre that was characterized by a large amount of swamplands and jungles, particularly along the Mekong Delta in the south of the country and the Hong River in the north. This type of terrain was particularly hard to operate in for French armored vehicles, particularly wheeled armored vehicles like the Panhard 178B or the British Coventry armored car, but even for tracked vehicles such as the American M8 Scott or M24 Chaffee. Tracked amphibious vehicles were an obvious answer as to how to bring armored firepower into swamplands and rivers. However, by 1949, France was yet to have any of those vehicles in its inventory. While the USA had a potential answer in the form of the LVT-4 amphibious assault vehicle and its assault version, the LVT-4A, the acquisition of such vehicles by the French had yet to be negotiated. On the 18th of January 1949, as the Indochina War had been raging on for more than 3 years by this point, the French Army headquarters requested the Direction of Armament Studies and Manufacturing, the service in charge of directing France's military research and production, for a light amphibious tank to be used in Indochina, and generally in France's colonies and overseas territories. Those other colonies and territories included Equatorial and Western Africa and French Guiana, all places which would also benefit from the use of an amphibious light tank. This vehicle was designed to weigh no more than 11 tons, offer good off-road performance, particularly in swampy terrain, and to mount a 75mm howitzer in a turret. On the 25th of April 1950, the Voisin branch of the state company of SNECMA accepted to design a vehicle for the light amphibious tank requirements, as well as to produce a scale model which would be used for flotation trials. The Société des Avions Voisin was, despite its name, more of a car manufacturing company that had been founded by an aviation pioneer rather than an aircraft manufacturing company. Founded in 1919, this company took the place of Aéroplane Voisin, an actual plane manufacturing company that had manufactured a number of different aircraft for France's aviation during the First World War. This included aircraft such as the Voisin 3 211 biplanes, which were notable for their pusher configuration. The Société des Avions Voisins had, after the end of the Second World War, been incorporated first into the engine manufacturer Gnome Ron, which was nationalized in 1945 to form the core of the state manufacturer SNECMA, Société Nationale des Études et de Construction de Moteurs d'Aviation, National Aircraft Engine Study and Construction Society. Despite the Société des Avions Voisins being out of operation for 5 years by 1950, its name remained in occasional use for designs which were produced by what remained of its design bureau. This was the case of the CA-11 light amphibious tank. Alongside a couple of other colonial amphibious projects from the same era, such as the CA-2 and CA-4 troop transport tankettes, the CA-11 appears to have been Voisin's sole foray into armored vehicles manufacturing. The manufacturing of a scale model apparently went quite well, with an order for a mild steel prototype being made quickly. This prototype was manufactured in 1951 to 1952 and presented to the French military at Châtellerault on the 20th of March 1953 for trials. The vehicle designed by the Voisin design team was a 12.5-ton tank. Despite this lightweight, the vehicle had fairly large dimensions, closer to a World War II medium tank than a light tank, measuring 5.81 meters long, 3.05 meters wide, and 2.66 meters high, with a ground clearance of 40 centimeters. These large dimensions are likely a consequence of the vehicle's amphibious hull design. The fairly large hull of the Voisin tank bears some resemblance to the general shape of the LVT-4, likely due to some inspiration being taken from the American design. The boat-like hull shape optimized flotation capacity, with a bow striking out at the front, the drive sprockets being installed at its side, and further back, a frontal plate angled backward. The suspension of the vehicle was relatively large, covering most of the hull's side, in a fashion that can be reminiscent of such vehicles as the pre-war B-1. The suspension featured 6 fairly large road wheels at the bottom of the hull, as well as what appears to be a tender wheel at the rear. 3 large box-shaped elements are located between the drive sprockets and the tender wheels. The purpose of these may have been to improve flotation. The tracks were also clearly influenced by the LVT vehicles, with a large curved grouser or spud on each link to improve traction in very soft ground, as well as drive when negotiating water obstacles. The engine, likely installed at the rear, was an air-cooled 8-cylinder, 10.8-litre unit producing 300 horsepower at 3000 RPM, although it is not known whether it ran on petrol or diesel. This engine gave the CA-11 a very respectable power-to-weight ratio of 24 horsepower per ton. While the fuel consumption and capacity are unknown, the vehicle is known to have had a respectable range of 300 kilometers. On road, the vehicle could reach a maximum speed of 54 kilometers per hour. On water, the maximum speed was 12. The CA-11 did not feature any hydrojet system. On water, its propulsion was assured by the tracks. These were 35 centimeters wide and appear to have used a flexible, most likely rubber construction. The armor layout of the vehicle is unknown, but the combination of lightweight and fairly large dimensions of Voisin's tank likely meant the armor was very thin, as typically expected of a counterinsurgency vehicle or amphibious tank. The crew configuration of the hull is also unknown. It may have had either merely a driver or perhaps 2 crew members. The Voisin CA-11's turret was not designed by Voisin, but instead by another company, the Société d'Application Générale d'Électricité et de Mécanique, the Society of General Electricity and Mechanic Applications, or SAGEM. Although there is little detailed information on it, observing the few known photos of the CA-11 show the turret appears to have used a welded construction. To the left, a large commander cupola featuring a number of episcopes is located. Another observation device can be found on the right side. Although the crew configuration of the CA-11 is unknown, the turret generally appears to have been geared to house a 2-man crew, with the commander to the left and the gunner to the right. The main armament of the CA-11 was a 75mm howitzer. Though the exact model is not specified in any source, the gun present on the vehicle shows many similarities with a 75mm gun that was developed for the Panhard 178B, but never ended up used in the post-war model of the Panhard 178 armored car. This was a 75mm gun, based on the very old 75mm model 1897, shortened but firing the same shells with a lower velocity. This gun was designated as the 75mm SA-45. This gun was never known to have been mounted on a Panhard 178B prototype, and if it was actually the gun present on the CA-11, the Voisin amphibious tank may have been the first known vehicle to mount this obscure armament. It would have had the notable advantage of using the same ammunition as the 75mm model 1897, a mainstay of the French army for decades, with large stocks of ammunition still in existence. That being said, while the CA-11's gun appears visually similar to the SA-45, if it actually used this gun has not yet been confirmed. The vehicle's ammunition stowage is unknown as well. It is, however, known that it used a 7.5mm Mag 31 as a coaxial machine gun, likely on the right of the main gun. Voisin's CA-11, though an interesting design for the challenges faced by France in Indochina, arrived way too late. By 1953, when the prototype was presented to the army, a solution had already been found to the problem of bringing armored firepower to the swamps and rivers of Indochina. The acquisition of American LVT-4s had been negotiated, with the first examples being delivered in 1950, before the prototype CA-11 was even unveiled. While the CA-11 could arguably have filled a niche for the French if the American deliveries had only included machine gun armed examples, it was rendered redundant, as the American deliveries included 75mm armed LVT-4As. The French themselves would eventually modify a number of troop transport LVTB-4s to accommodate 75mm recoilless guns, or even turreted 40mm Bofors autocannons. With the presence of the LVT-4 in the French army, the procurement and production of the CA-11 would have been a costly and redundant affair. The Indochina War in general was, by that point, a costly and very unpopular affair in which France was embroiled, with no hope of quickly recovering the colony. With little enthusiasm for the idea of remaining involved in the region, France ended up pulling out in 1954, leaving, as far as possible, friendly local governments in place. The end of the Indochina War likely removed all enthusiasm for a colonial amphibious tank for a time, although the LVT-4s which had been obtained were conserved. They went on to be used to form an amphibious assault school in Algeria, and were eventually used during the Suez Crisis against Egypt in 1956. The Voisin CA-11 project was likely shelved indefinitely, marking an end to Voisin's short foray into armed vehicles manufacturing. As for the manufactured prototype, its fate is unknown, but it very likely ended up scrapped.